It's Cybin time. I did my best to make a cyberpunk outfit based off of what's in my closet. I feel like the crop is very common in cyberpunk, so I just lean into it. Which I'm happy to say is largely composed of merch from today's sponsor, me. Because as of today, my limited edition merch drop is open to the public, and everyone is going to be able to get all of these designs from now until January 17th. I will be sending a thank you video to every single person who buys merch from this drop, so if you'd like to go ahead and get your hands on either the disheveled goblin hoodie, or a plot armor tee, or even just a hydration vessel tumbler, check out the merch shelf, finally linked below all my videos. Back to the review. Cyberpunk Edgerunners is the latest adaptation of the cyberpunk world. Before this, brought to life in 2077, and before that, in the cyberpunk tabletop RPG. Now, on a raw aesthetics value, cyberpunk is one of my favorite genres of all time. I will often get through mediocre stories within a cyberpunk world just because of how much I enjoy the bombastic approach to characters, weapons, tech. It's usually just really fun. But I'm very happy to say I don't think that style over substance critique actually carries over to Cyberpunk Edgerunners. I do have criticisms of this show, and I think it's a bit overhyped, but I still think it's absolutely a worthwhile watch, especially if you're a Cyberpunk fan, or just like some really dark storytelling, which, yes, that remains true here, as it often does for Cyberpunk. Now, this show follows a main protagonist named David Martinez, and the downfall of his life as he goes from a trajectory where his mother is working extremely hard to help him eventually land a corpo job to ending up running with mercenary crews. That is just the initiating incidents. I won't go any further than that. But while we're talking about those initiating incidents, I do want to get into one of my first critiques of the show as well as praise. Now, the beginning of this show, I think the overall animation style, especially when it's at its best, is some of the most enjoyable I've seen this year. The action sequences especially, there's some stylistic choices that are made that I absolutely love, to just show the power and angles to net running and the enhancements that implants can put in you. So enjoyable. That being said though, when the animation isn't at its best, it does feel like they kind of ran out of time. This is a little less prevalent in the later episodes that feel like they got a little more love and care for the actual animation of them, but there are long sequences where you are literally looking at someone's feet while people are talking, and it really comes across just because that's all they could really show you right now. And there's quite a bit of guilt of also just still shots. And I know this is gonna bother people, some a lot less than me, but it's something that kind of drives me nuts. I hate to be looking at a screen on something that is essentially a static shot, aside from one element that's moving, where that could easily just establish what that element moving is trying to establish in 3 seconds. On a whole though, that criticism is way outweighed by the highs that the animation provides. There were some truly spectacular and beautiful moments painted within this show that emotionally resonated, not only because of how the story earned those moments, but because of how just gorgeous and detailed, which also just brings us to the world as a whole. And this is by far my favorite element of not only Cyberpunk Edgerunners, but Cyberpunk 2077 and the original tabletop RPG, which I'm currently running a D&D campaign with some of my friends. This world asks the question, how dystopian could a corporate future get? And then it decides to fold in every nightmarish idea that could possibly come to fruition and make them just either small background elements or core parts of the narrative. And it's so immersive, and there's so many things in our world that you see in this world just exaggerated a bit, that it not only feels like a living, breathing city. Night City is maybe one of the most fleshed out cities I've come across in fiction, but it also feels like when I'm 90, the world could look more like this than I would like to think. And then Edgerunners takes its admittedly fairly small cast of characters for a full season of television, at least in terms of the characters you're supposed to really connect with. Essentially, it's just this mercenary crew and a couple of the antagonists, but it then folds them into this world and how there's this established system of mercenaries and corporate espionage and corruption. Not only does David feel like he's going down a wonderful spiral into chaos, but everyone is in the midst of their own downfall into debauchery, and they're your protagonists. They brutalize people. In my humble opinion, Cyberpunk is at its best when it just doesn't pull any punches, and it's willing to show you that if you just unlock the absolute desires and depth and depravity that humanity is capable of, and then formed a society around it as the Night City is, there's really no limits to the small moments of depravity to the grandiose, over-the-top, gory murders our protagonists are taking part in. And yet, you still really manage to care about them. I don't want to get too deep into the entire crew because there probably are still a lot of people out there who haven't seen this show, and I want you to kind of discover these people's dynamics and quirks on your own, but I will talk about Lucy. Now, overall, there are a few beats to decisions Lucy makes throughout the season that really felt like they were made just to move the story along and came across a bit out of character for me. That didn't detract enough, though, from the overall character for me to not absolutely love this mysterious, seductive, intelligent foil to our main protagonist, who acts as this gateway into a darker life that David then runs with. She also is provided enough development and motivation that it never feels like she's just there to serve David's character or move him along. She is going through her own independent arc right alongside David and ends up telling him no repeatedly because of it. I just really appreciate that. That felt super into character and more than outweighed the negatives I had. What I just said about Lucy probably set off a bunch of red flags for various people out there who are experienced readers in the cyberpunk or even just sci-fi genres. Because the femme fatale, standoffish, seductive type love interest woman who is more steeped in the darker sides of a sci-fi world is a trope that has existed for literally the better part of a century for these specific subgenres. But what I like what Cyberpunk Edgerunners does is it's not afraid to lean into cliches like this and know, yes, the viewer will be used to who exactly this character is in the beginning, but let's take that natural understanding and use it to speedrun fleshing out the relationship dynamics between them, and then use the world around these characters to pack in some personality and specifics that do aid them standing out from the crowd a bit. And that I very much so appreciate, but it extends on to David too, who I found to be a well-motivated, emotionally deep protagonist who has some personality to him. But if you ask me to pick my top 100 protagonists of all time, David's not going to crack the list. He's fairly stereotypical, but well done. He's not exceptional, but it's the relationships between characters and the world itself that add enough flavor to keep me interested to the last episode. So don't be afraid when you start this show if you're like, wow, I'm calling quite a few things here and a lot of this is doing what I've seen before. It uses that familiarity to its benefit, especially in the last third of the season, because intelligent emotional writing takes familiarity and utilizes it for its advantage, and that is why there is several points throughout Cyberpunk Edgerunners where I was going, wow, I'm not about to cry. Watching David himself make so many crucially bad decisions, but totally understandable ones that push him further and further away from sanity. And I want to take a beat here to talk about cyberpsychosis, which is something, if you're familiar with the games, plays a very large role in the overall development of the narrative here in Cyberpunk Edgerunners. And it's utilized, I feel, far more deeply throughout Cyberpunk Edgerunners than I've ever personally come across it in the game. Granted, I've only played through the game a couple of times and I've never 100% of it, so possibly there's a side quest out there that just leads you into a super deep explanation and character-rich utilization of cyberpsychosis, and I just haven't found it. Let me know how to get it in the comments down below if you want to see me do it on Twitch. But how cyberpsychosis plays throughout the narrative of Cyberpunk Edgerunners is fascinating. I'm gonna actually call back to the Wheel of Time, one of my favorite fantasy series of all time, and how the magic system in that world slowly drives men who use magic insane. Cyberpunk Edgerunners has a similar insanity angle that the more powerful people are getting, the less attached to reality they are. And I've already had great fun with that mechanic in the tabletop game I'm running in this world. And seeing it so emotionally utilized within Edgerunners was, again, just like cool. There's such a just enjoyably cool element to Cyberpunk so often. It was poignant enough within the story that it actually made me go from being like, I'd love cybernetic implants to be able to do all this cool stuff, to instead like, actually, nope. Because it's treated as an addiction of sorts, something you can always justify buying into more, which is something that before I even watched this show, I had somewhat included my own cyberpunk book I'm working on, A Witch's Sin. The main character in that book I was writing, again, before I watched this, due to trauma and fear inside of them, is constantly over-investing and just improving their own cybernetics because they went through some spoilers. And And from a writing angle, it was so cool to see someone kind of explore the inverse of that. Whereas for me, I utilized it as a representation of something the character went through and the trauma manifesting within themselves. Cyberpunk Edgerunners is utilizing the cyberpsychosis and cybernetic implants as more of a representation of what is actively happening to David, and how this world is so greedy, corrupt, and full of people f***ing each other over that no matter who you are, you're gonna be beat up, chewed out, and spit up enough that the threat of cyberpsychosis is not enough to prevent you from putting more things into your body. Oh, emotional metaphors manifesting physically magnificently. But here we have to get into just the straight up negative angles to the show for me. And that's gonna come into the broader structure and pacing of the show. It feels textbook constrained narratively by the episode count. There was an obvious, for me, need of at least 3 or 4 more episodes in what this show covers in the final 3. In fact, structurally, I think I would have liked this more if about the 2/3 part way through the season, that had just been season 1, because the last leg of the show feels like a whole season 2 kind of folded into a 1. But I kind of understand if they did have an episode limitation, why that had to be, and what I really would like to see Cyberpunk Edgerunners be as the show continues on, if there'll be a season 2, I'll have that up on the screen now, is just following a new protagonist in a different part of this city that is so fantastic to explore, and maybe have tangential relations back towards other seasons or even the game we've seen, just like we did see in season 1 to the game, because that adds a layer of danger for me as a viewer, because you never really know who will be able to make it to a season 2, and if you're willing to swap protagonists, you don't even know if the main lead is going to make it into a next season, whether it's a background character or just a supporting one. And then unfortunately, in my final real critique of this show, amongst this vibrant city, there wasn't that great of an antagonist for me to hook into. There's people brought in from the game that I feel like the show is a little too much just leaning on you being like, you recognize them, right? Despite being voiced by fantastic voices like Giancarlo Esposito, there is a gravitas to when they're there, but I don't get enough narratively when any of the antagonists are on screen for me to really care about them, especially compared to how much I end up buying into characters like David and Lucy. There needs to be a bit more balance, and there absolutely is a feeling of threat happening, but it feels kind of just like corporate villain, and not much beyond that, which was surprising because with how quickly this show got me to care about David's mother and what she was going through. I expected it to be able to hook me into the main antagonists a bit more, but they are where I felt this show was a bit more style over substance. And then a criticism Kayla wants me to include is that while the voice acting, she agrees, was really well done, the editing of the dialogue apparently to her ear was not awesome. And again, I think the performances were fantastic, but how the dialogue actually sounds to the ear in conversations sometimes can be noticeably jarring. I put in high quality headphones and listened to a couple examples that Kayla was talking about, and I was like, oh yeah, there it is. It's not my favorite show of the year, and it was hyped to hell for me, but I'm happy to say, even with that hype and the flaws I did see there, I absolutely enjoyed Cyberpunk Edgerunners. I'm totally down for a season 2, and I would give it a pretty damn solid 7.5 out of 10. I just really wish it had a couple more episodes, some more time in editing, and some more time in animation. But now I'm off to go kill corporate scum, listen to the incredibly badass Cyberpunk Edgerunners soundtrack, and record a bunch of thank you videos for people who check out the merch store at danielbgreen.com. Thank you everyone so much, and have a good one. Bye!